June 22, 1944. 0540 hours. Eastern edge of St. Albin, France. A gray marine layer sat over the shattered village and reduced visibility to 50 meters. The Allied advance had stalled for 2 days because of a single reinforced machine gun nest dug into the basement of a farmhouse that had already been sheared in half by artillery. The stone walls still stood, but the lower windows had been widened into firing ports. Every time the infantry tried to move through the orchard or cross the narrow lane, the MG-42 opened with terrifying precision. Its bursts cut through trees, walls, and bodies. The position dominated the only workable line of approach into the eastern vineyards. Without taking it, the regiment could not move. Private Thomas Miller lay in a shallow depression behind a collapsed stone fence. He had spent the last 40 minutes listening to the familiar rhythm of the German gun. The pattern never changed. 3-second burst. Pause. 2-second burst. Longer pause. Short probing burst. The cycle repeated. The crew was disciplined and confident. They knew they had control. Miller watched the orchard floor where 2 medics now crawled to pull in another casualty. The platoon had already lost 9 men trying to cross the open lane. Doctrine said to flank, but the flanking terrain required crossing a narrow rise completely exposed to the firing arc. Every attempt ended with the same sound, the crack and snap of high-velocity rounds slicing through bark and soil. The platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Rourke, had already sent runners looking for smoke support and armor. The answer kept coming back the same. Armor was stuck behind debris on the main road. Smoke was limited and assigned to another company. Air support was grounded by weather. Mortars could help but needed accurate coordinates, something no one could gather because the nest's firing slit was hidden behind sandbags inside the basement shadow. They could not risk another head or binocular appearing above the broken stone wall. The German gunner was too fast. 2 scouts had tried it earlier and paid for it instantly. Miller studied the ground in front of him. He had always been quiet, the sort of man who said little but noticed everything. His hands carried the muscle memory of years spent fitting drain pipes, adjusting chimney flues, and aligning vents for proper airflow. Before the war, he worked for a contractor in Ohio. Most days were spent crawling under houses, installing ceramic pipe, checking angles, or climbing onto roofs to adjust ventilation shafts. He had learned how to judge material strength, light reflection, and the precise way narrow openings directed air and vision. On the battlefield, these skills felt almost useless. Yet, watching the trench lines slowly fill with wounded, he felt something stir. Beside him lay debris from the destroyed village. Broken roof tile, splintered beams, bricks, and 3 curved ceramic drain flues. He picked up one piece. It weighed little, but the angle was smooth and the inner surface reflective when hit by light. A shard of mirror from a shattered vanity lay nearby. He turned the pipe piece and held the mirror behind it. The angle created a narrow viewing slit that captured a thin slice of the battlefield without exposing anything behind it. The idea struck him fast. If he aligned 2 or 3 flue pieces, sealed gaps with mud, and fixed the mirror at the correct angle, he could create a crude but effective observation tool. Rourke crawled over, mud thick on his fatigues. He expected Miller to say something about another casualty. Instead, Miller held up the ceramic pipe. Rourke frowned. The men nearby looked over and laughed quietly, thinking Miller had snapped under the stress. Miller explained the concept in short, clear words. A narrow flue, mirror angled inside, viewing slot on the far end, positioned low enough behind debris to see the nest's internal alignment without exposing the operator. Rourke stared at him, confused at first, then curious. He had seen too many men die in the last 24 hours. Any idea that offered an advantage deserved a chance. Miller dragged over more flue sections and arranged them. He broke and chipped edges with a rock to adjust curvature. He positioned the mirror fragment deep inside the pipe. He sealed joints with wet soil and ash so no light reflected outward that might give away its position. The structure looked crude, almost laughable, a muddy tube reinforced by twine stripped from a torn ration crate. The nearby rifleman smirked. One joked that Miller was building a child's toy. Another said he should save the arts and crafts for after the war. Miller ignored them and kept adjusting angles. The bigger challenge was finding a firing angle that allowed the device to rest low while still giving a line of sight into the shadowed basement slit. He crawled forward with the contraption held close to his chest and slid behind the thickest portion of the collapsed wall. Each centimeter of ground carried risk, but he moved with careful patience. The MG-42 fired another series of bursts into the orchard, oblivious to the quiet construction unfolding 40 meters away. Miller positioned the flue between 2 stones and looked through the narrow slit. The mirror caught a faint glint of movement inside the darkened basement. He adjusted it slightly. The image sharpened. He could now see one of the sandbags, the edge of the machine gun barrel, and the faint silhouette of the loader's helmet as he passed ammunition belts. The angle allowed him to study their firing rhythm and field of fire without lifting his head above cover. He crawled back and reported the observation to Rourke. The sergeant called over the mortar team leader. They needed precise range and direction. Miller returned to the Flue and started mapping each detail he could see. He counted the seconds between rotation shifts, noted exactly when the loader leaned right to pull the next belt, and traced the muzzle flash reflection patterns in the mirror. These details pinpointed the firing port depth and exact position of the gun shield behind the sandbags. The mortar team needed target reference points. Miller provided the angle of the collapsed chimney to the left of the house, the location of a blackened oak stump in the orchard, and the line where the basement shadow met the top stair. Rourke scribbled corrections until everything aligned. The team adjusted their tubes. Elevation set. Charges checked. The village remained silent except for the steady German bursts. The orchard leaves trembled with every impact. Miller stayed pressed behind the wall and kept watching through the clay flue. He traced the recoil pattern inside the basement slit. The gunner leaned slightly left every time he fired a long burst. The loader crouched low, passing belts from a crate on the rear table. The supporting assistant was barely visible, only the top of his field cap flickering in the mirror whenever he reached for another belt. These small movements told Miller exactly where each man stood and how tightly the nest was arranged. The machine gun could not pivot far beyond its current arc. It was boxed into a reinforced corner. That limited rotation created two blind zones that no one had been able to confirm until now. Rourke crawled back and asked if he could estimate depth. Miller measured it by how the muzzle flash reflected across the curved ceramic interior. He adjusted the mirror, noted where the light hit the edges, and calculated distance based on the spread of illumination. His answer was confident. The mortarman listened, skeptical at first, but Miller explained how he had used the same trick to determine depth in old chimneys before installing flues. The principle was the same. The mortar team leader accepted it and began adjusting elevation by a few degrees. The men around them stopped laughing when they saw the sergeant taking Miller seriously. The strange clay tube no longer looked like a toy. It looked like hope. They had been stuck in the same ditch for hours, pinned by a gun that should have been neutralized long ago. If Miller's contraption worked, they would finally move. The mortar crew prepared the first illumination shell. They wanted a soft flash, not a full burst, enough to confirm Miller's calculations without exposing their own position. Miller watched through the flue as the sky flickered. The faint reflection lit the basement interior for half a second. He saw everything far clearer than before. The sandbag wall was staggered. The gun rested on a metal brace welded onto a wooden beam. The crew had a small table for ammunition. The loader knelt behind two crates. The assistant leaned near a collapsed staircase. Miller called out updated corrections. The mortar team fired the test round. The shell landed 2 meters short and left, throwing dust through the orchard. The German gunner responded instantly. The MG-42 opened with a furious burst toward the sound of the impact. Dirt erupted across the ditch. Fragments punched into the wall above Miller's head. But the gunner had no idea that the real threat was still quietly adjusting behind a clay tube. Miller kept observing. The crew shifted positions because of the dust. The loader moved slightly forward. The assistant edged closer to the inner wall. Miller relayed all of it. The mortar team corrected again. Another round landed. This one hit closer, just right of the barrel. The debris shattered across the sandbags. The gun paused. The crew hesitated. They knew something was coming, but they could not see from where. Rourke urged Miller to keep watching. Miller steadied the flue, wiped mud from the edge, and leaned in again. He studied the angle of a cracked supporting beam deep in the shadow. The mortar team needed a precise vertical correction. He gave it. The mortar leader nodded, set the next round, and adjusted charge. The third shell fired. It landed almost perfectly in line but still hit the right edge of the basement. Another correction. The German gunner opened fire again, spraying the orchard with blind fury. They were panicking. Their tight rhythm broke. The loader made a mistake, feeding the belt at a poor angle. Miller reported the hesitation. This detail told him the crew was disoriented. A moment of weakness. A chance to strike. Rourke signaled the mortar team to prepare live rounds for destructive fire. 3 tubes ready. Charges set. Miller provided one final correction. He shifted the mirror, adjusted the clay flue angle by pressing a stone underneath, and aligned the slit with the faintest glow inside the basement. He inhaled slowly, exhaled. Then he gave the last number. The mortar team fired. The first shell crashed directly into the basement opening. The explosion tore through the sandbag wall and blew debris across the village lane. The machine gun fell silent for the first time in 2 days. The second shell landed a split second later, collapsing the wooden brace that held the gun platform. The third shell hit the rear corner, destroying the ammunition table and throwing smoke into the stairwell. Miller watched everything through the clay flue. The blast wave shook the pipe, but the mirror held. He saw no movement inside the basement. No silhouettes. No recoil flashes. Nothing. The nest was gone. Rourke shouted to the platoon. The orchard erupted with movement as men who had been pinned for hours finally advanced. Riflemen moved from cover to cover. The second squad crossed the lane without drawing fire. The first squad climbed the orchard slope and secured the flanking rise. The air felt lighter. The sense of suffocation lifted. The platoon pushed forward, taking ground that had cost blood all morning. Miller stepped back from the clay flue. His hands were shaking. Not from fear but from the intensity of the work. He had focused so much on angles, reflections, and alignment that the rest of the battlefield felt distant. Now the noise returned all at once. Boots running. Orders shouted. The crack of rifles. The thump of grenades clearing nearby cellars. Rourke grabbed Miller's shoulder and told him the company owed him their advance. The sergeant meant it. Without precise observation, the machine gun nest would have taken countless more lives. Miller quietly nodded. He was not interested in praise. He only cared that the men could move again. The platoon leader reported the nest destroyed to battalion. The message spread quickly. A crude ceramic periscope had solved a problem that higher command had failed to fix. No one understood how at first. They would learn later. The clay flue peak slot remained wedged between two stones. Mud cracked along its seams. The mirror fragment inside was scorched from the reflected flash of explosions. It looked fragile. It looked accidental. Yet it had changed the course of the fight. The company moved through the eastern side of St. Albin with new momentum. The fall of the machine gun nest unlocked a section of the village that had stalled the battalion's progress since dawn. Rifle teams cleared doorways. Engineers checked for tripwires. Medics pulled wounded men back toward the orchard aid point. The air carried dust from collapsing walls and the lingering smell of burned propellant. Miller followed the platoon as they advanced, staying behind the lead elements. He still carried the clay flue device, though it had cracked along the middle seam. Rourke told him to keep it. They might need it again. The thought felt unlikely, but Miller understood that tools improvised under pressure often became valuable more than once. The platoon entered a narrow street lined with damaged homes. The structures had taken repeated artillery hits and many roofs were missing. Debris covered the road. Rourke ordered second squad to check the left row of houses. First squad cleared the right. Miller stayed near the center, keeping a low profile. As they moved deeper, the German resistance stiffened. Rifle fire cracked from upper windows. A sniper round hit the cobblestones near Miller's foot. The troops scattered into cover. Rourke pointed toward a damaged stable with a heavy timber frame. Miller sprinted there and took shelter inside a broken stall. The sniper fired again. The round hit a support beam and kicked splinters against Miller's face. The angle of the shot told him the sniper was elevated and positioned toward the northern edge of the village. That direction led toward a small ridge overlooking the vineyards. If the Germans held that ridge, the platoon could get pinned again. Rourke moved in beside him. The sergeant wanted eyes on the sniper's firing angle. Standard binoculars were useless from their current cover. Anyone lifting above the stall door would get hit. Rourke looked at the clay flue tube in Miller's hands. Miller understood immediately. He crawled to a lower gap in the stable wall and set the flue against a beam. The crack in the device had widened. Miller reinforced it with a piece of cloth and tightened the mud binding by rubbing moisture from the stable trough onto it. He adjusted the mirror and aligned the interior angle until he could see a thin sliver of the rooftops across the street. A single glint flashed from a window. The sniper shifted position. The mirror picked up the reflection of a scope lens. Miller reported the exact window. Rourke relayed the coordinates to a designated marksman who took position behind a broken cart. The marksman raised his rifle with slow precision and fired. The window shattered. The sniper did not fire again. Miller pulled the flue back and checked the inner alignment. The device had somehow survived the second engagement. Rourke shook his head in disbelief. The platoon moved forward. Resistance weakened as they pushed toward the central square. They reached a street where a cart had overturned and blocked the main path. German riflemen were falling back from the square toward the northern ridge. Their orderly retreat indicated they were trying to regroup around a second defensive line. Rourke called the platoon leader. The lieutenant ordered everyone to prepare for another strong point. The village square was wide and exposed. Crossing it without observation would be reckless. The lieutenant asked if Miller could use his Flue to scout the square without exposing anyone. Miller nodded. The platoon formed a perimeter while he crawled to the corner of a collapsed butcher shop. He lowered the Flue to ground level and pointed it toward the central well. The mirror caught faint movement. German troops were placing 2 light machine guns behind knocked-over tables. They were reinforcing a position that could cover the entire square. Miller described their layout to the lieutenant. The platoon adjusted their plan. Instead of moving directly across, they sent one squad through a narrow alley to flank the position while another squad fired from the butcher shop to distract the defenders. This plan avoided a frontal assault and saved the platoon from unnecessary casualties. The Germans withdrew from the well after facing fire from 2 angles. The square was secured. The battalion command group arrived 15 minutes later. They wanted to know how the machine gun nest had been destroyed and why the platoon had moved through the eastern side faster than expected. Rourke explained everything. The officers studied the clay Flue tube. Some dismissed it as luck. Others understood it was more than that. The battalion intelligence officer questioned Miller directly. He asked how he had built it. Miller gave simple explanations. He talked about chimney angles, reflective surfaces, airflow shafts, and the way light behaved inside narrow spaces. The officer took notes. He asked if Miller could rebuild it for demonstration. Miller said he could if he found the right materials. The battalion colonel arrived during the discussion. He inspected the cracked ceramic tube. He asked how many men it had saved. Rourke said it had allowed observation of the basement nest that would have killed many more. The colonel nodded and ordered the item to be kept intact for further study. The battalion moved on toward the ridge. Miller stayed with the platoon. As they advanced, the colonel walked beside the lieutenant and asked if such improvised tools had been attempted before. The lieutenant explained that standard periscopes existed but were too large or too limited for specific angles. Miller's creation allowed a narrow, protected view without revealing a silhouette. The colonel said resourcefulness mattered more than equipment. War forced solutions from unexpected places. A ceramic Flue used for homes had become a battlefield tool. It was not standard issue, but it had done what the manuals could not. Miller felt no pride yet. The fight was not over. The ridge still held enemy positions. Mortars could strike from above. Machine guns could cover the southern slope. The battalion needed accurate observation again. Rourke asked Miller if the Flue could survive another use. Miller said he would try. He reinforced it again with mud and cloth. The mirror was scratched but still usable. The platoon climbed the slope toward the ridge, moving through shell holes and broken stone. The ridge crest appeared ahead. A small trench ran along the top. German riflemen fired from the edge. The battalion returned fire. Movement slowed. The colonel needed eyes on the trench without losing another scout. Miller stepped forward and prepared the clay Flue for another attempt. The battalion halted 50 meters below the ridge crest. The German trench line sat just over the top, dug into soil hardened by weeks of occupation. Their rifles fired in short bursts. A light machine gun shifted positions along the trench to prevent any concentrated push. The slope offered little cover. Any man standing too high risked being hit. The colonel wanted positions mapped before committing another advance. He called for Miller. Rourke brought Miller forward. The platoon leader briefed him. They needed to know how many firing points were active, where the machine gun shifted, and whether the trench had rear exits. Without this information, any assault could break against unseen obstacles. Miller nodded and scanned the slope for a vantage spot. He found a shallow depression where a mortar fragment had carved into the dirt. The angle was low, but the clay Flue might still catch part of the trench interior. He lay flat and positioned the device. The crack had widened again. He pressed more mud into the seam. He secured the mirror by wedging a small pebble behind it. The surface reflected light poorly now, but it still formed an image. Miller angled the Flue upward until he caught the ridge line. At first he saw only sky. Then the mirror shifted and the edge of the German trench flickered into view. The trench interior was shadowed and narrow. Miller took slow, shallow breaths while adjusting the angle. The mirror captured the movement of a rifleman leaning forward to fire and then dropping back behind the trench wall. A second man passed ammunition belts. Miller watched the pattern until he could identify their positions. He relayed each detail to the lieutenant. Rourke asked for clarification. Miller explained that the machine gun team was operating from the center of the trench, not the left side as expected. The shifting fire that hit the southern slope came from rapid repositioning, not multiple guns. This meant the trench had a small platform inside where the gunner could move the weapon. If they could suppress that platform, the entire trench would lose its strongest defensive point. The colonel listened as Miller explained the distances using reference points like a broken tree stump on the crest and a cluster of rocks near the trench lip. The intelligence officer wrote down numbers. The mortar platoon prepared fire missions. They needed an exact read on the depth of the trench at the machine gun's pivot point. Miller focused on that next. The mirror reflected the flash of the machine gun as it fired again. The recoil caused the barrel to tilt slightly each burst. Miller measured that tilt by noting how the reflection struck different parts of the Flue interior. He gave the mortarmen the vertical height of the platform. They adjusted elevation. A German grenade explosion shook the slope. Dirt scattered over Miller's helmet. He held the clay Flue steady. The image trembled but did not vanish. He saw a German soldier rush to the right side of the trench to call to another team. Miller reported it. The lieutenant confirmed the trench had a side tunnel or firing alcove. They could now map 2 positions instead of 1. The mortar officer smirked. He said he had never seen a periscope like that. Miller said it was not a periscope. It was just a Flue with a mirror. The officer replied that whatever it was, it worked. The first ranging round fired. It landed slightly behind the trench. German riflemen ducked but returned fire quickly. Miller continued observing. He adjusted the angle again and reported where the dust plume lifted. The next round landed closer. The colonel ordered 2 tubes to focus on the center platform and 1 tube to strike the right alcove. The second ranging round hit the trench lip. The blast rocked the machine gun position. Miller saw 1 silhouette fall backward. He reported damage. The mortar officer adjusted final fire. 3 shells launched in quick rhythm. The first struck the platform directly. The explosion threw sandbags into the air and silenced the machine gun. The second shell collapsed part of the trench roof above the alcove. The third landed behind the trench, creating shock that forced the remaining defenders to retreat down a rear slope path. The ridge line went quiet. The battalion surged upward. Miller lifted the clay Flue. The crack was nearly full length now. The mirror had chipped. Mud dripped from the seams. The device had completed its 3rd engagement. He was not sure it would survive a 4th. Rourke reached him and told him to move with the platoon. They climbed to the ridge crest and entered the trench. The destruction was clear. Sandbags ripped open. The machine gun smashed and buried under debris. The alcove collapsed. German equipment scattered everywhere. The colonel inspected the trench and then turned to Miller. He said that days of stalled fighting had been ended by a piece of ceramic pipe and a mirror. Miller clarified that it was simple geometry. The colonel disagreed. He said it was initiative, something manuals could not teach. He told Rourke that the platoon had earned a commendation for breaking the 2 strongest positions in the village. The battalion pushed beyond the ridge and continued toward the vineyards. The enemy resistance weakened. The Germans had expected their strong points to hold for much longer. With both neutralized, their defensive line fractured. As the daylight grew stronger, Miller walked alongside the platoon. He held the clay Flue under his arm. The men who had mocked it earlier no longer laughed. Some asked how he had learned to make it. Others wanted to know how he could see so clearly through something improvised. Miller explained in short, practical terms. He said narrow flues forced light into specific angles. Mirrors directed that light where the eye needed to see. He said houses taught him more about angles than any military manual. The soldiers listened carefully. They understood that war rewarded any skill that helped men survive. The battalion halted near the edge of the vineyards. They needed to prepare for possible counterattacks. Officers gathered to discuss the next phase of advance. The colonel spoke with brigade command over radio. He mentioned Miller's device. Brigade wanted to know more. The intelligence officer asked Miller if he could build another. Miller said he could if given ceramic pipe and another mirror. They told him there were ruins ahead. Plenty of material there. The brigade ordered a demonstration to be delivered after the vineyards were secured. Miller looked at the clay tube again. It was battered and fragile. But the idea behind it was solid. If he had more time and better materials, he could build a version less likely to crack. One with smoother inner surfaces. One with adjustable angles. He wondered how many positions such a tool could reveal over the rest of the campaign. Rourke told him the battalion would need more of them. He said the device had changed how they approached fortified positions. He said Miller had done more than help. He had altered the fight. The battalion advanced through the vineyard rows at a controlled pace. The Germans had fallen back from the ridge in disorder. They left scattered ammunition crates, broken field packs, and abandoned entrenching tools. Evidence of a hasty retreat spread across the terrain. But no one in the battalion trusted it. Retreat often hid traps, ambushes, or a second prepared line. The colonel ordered careful movement. Every few meters the platoons paused to scan the distance. Miller stayed near the middle of the formation. The clay flue rested across his forearm. It was barely holding together. The mirror's surface was scratched and dulled by dust. But Miller kept it with him because the officers insisted they might need it again. He scanned the vineyard from time to time, though the gently rolling terrain did not give the same kind of cover structure that made the flue effective earlier. The battalion reached a cluster of stone huts at the end of the vineyard. The colonel halted the advance. German forces could be inside. 1st Platoon, Miller's platoon, was ordered forward to clear the structures. The huts were simple, each a single room with a stone oven and small windows. They looked empty, but Miller had learned not to trust appearances. Rourke sent 2 teams around the sides while Miller and the lieutenant approached the front. Miller inspected the windows through the flue. At first he saw only darkness. Then, as he rotated the device and angled the mirror, he saw shadows move across the interior of the left hut. He reported it. Rourke lifted his fist and froze the platoon. A moment later 2 German riflemen tried to slip out the back door. They were met by the squad covering the rear and taken prisoner. The platoon cleared the remaining huts without further resistance. The company commander praised Miller again. The flue had located an ambush that would have cost lives. The battalion secured the huts and set a temporary perimeter. Brigade headquarters sent a message. They wanted Miller brought to the rear command post for a demonstration. The colonel told Rourke to escort him. Miller hesitated. He preferred staying with the platoon, but Rourke insisted. Orders were orders. They moved down a dirt track toward the command post situated in the remains of an old winery. Operations tents were spread across the courtyard. Radio operators hunched over equipment. Staff officers walked between maps pinned to wooden boards. When Miller arrived, brigade staff gathered around the clay flue. Some smiled in disbelief. Others looked annoyed that something so simple had solved a problem that higher command had struggled with. The brigade commander, a tall man with a stern voice, asked Miller to explain every detail. Miller kept his explanation short and clear. He talked about how he found the flue sections, how he angled the mirror, how the curved interior forced light along predictable lines. He described each adjustment made under fire, each refinement added as the device cracked. He did not inflate his role. He focused on the practical steps. The brigade engineers were impressed. One asked if Miller had mechanical training. Miller said no. He worked construction before the war. The engineer nodded and said sometimes the best battlefield tools came from tradesmen, not armories. The brigade commander ordered engineers to study the device and replicate its design with whatever materials they could acquire. He wanted a small batch produced for field testing. The engineers took measurements and sketched diagrams. They asked Miller to hold the flue while they inspected angles. They asked about distances. He answered everything simply. When they finished, the brigade commander dismissed most of the staff, but he kept Miller and Rourke behind. He said the war was full of men who followed orders but few who thought beyond instructions. He said Miller's tool had demonstrated initiative at a level that saved lives. He told Rourke that soldiers like Miller kept units alive when doctrine failed. Miller thanked him, but he insisted it had not been complicated. The commander disagreed. He said most soldiers would not have thought to use a construction skill to solve a tactical problem. He said innovation often came from quiet men who saw details others ignored. Rourke escorted Miller back to the platoon. When they arrived, the men greeted him with respect they had not shown earlier in the campaign. They knew what the flue had done. The platoon leader approached and said brigade had issued instructions. If they encountered more fortified positions, Miller would be part of the advance observation team. He would choose vantage points and provide visual intelligence before riflemen exposed themselves. The platoon moved again as the battalion resumed its advance toward the next village. The landscape opened into rolling fields. The Germans had pulled back to regroup. Artillery fire echoed from the north. Smoke rose in columns along the horizon. The battalion expected to make contact again by evening. 2 hours later, scouts reported a fortified intersection ahead. The Germans had dug in around a stone well house and placed riflemen in ditches on both sides of the road. A machine gun was confirmed near a barn. The colonel ordered a halt. He wanted positions scouted before committing troops. Rourke called Miller forward. The platoon needed a covered observation point. Miller crouched beside the remains of a broken wall and inspected the terrain. The Flue was nearly destroyed, but it still had some functionality. He found a low angle behind a cluster of stones and positioned the Flue. The mirror reflected the barn. He adjusted the angle. The image sharpened enough to show movement inside the doorway. He saw the gun crew preparing another machine gun. He saw ammunition crates stacked in the corner. He saw the loader adjusting the belt. He saw a second rifleman on the left side of the door. He reported every detail. The lieutenant relayed the information to the colonel. Mortar teams prepared to fire. Machine gunners repositioned for suppressive fire. The entire battalion adjusted its plan based on what Miller reported through a cracked ceramic tube. The device was now shaking with every movement. The mud holding it together had dried and began to crumble. The Flue could fail any moment. Miller held it steady with both hands. He gave the last correction needed for the mortar strike. The first rounds fired. The mortar rounds struck the barn with hard impact. The first shell landed short and kicked dust across the road. The second hit the barn wall and tore a wide gap through the stone. The third punched into the doorway. The machine gun inside fell silent. Smoke drifted from the shattered roof. The battalion prepared to advance. Miller lowered the clay Flue. The device had reached its limit. The crack split the tube almost in half. The mirror shook loose and dropped into the grass. The Flue had survived 6 engagements. It could not survive another. Rourke told Miller to let it break. The platoon moved forward to secure the intersection. German riflemen tried to regroup at the well house. The battalion pressed from 3 directions. The riflemen fired a short volley, then withdrew north. A few tried to hold the ditch lines. They gave up when a squad flanked their position. The intersection fell in less than 10 minutes. Accurate observation had shaped the fight before it started. The battalion commander walked the field after the fight ended. He inspected the destroyed barn and the collapsed position inside. He asked Rourke where Miller was. Rourke pointed toward the broken wall. Miller stood there with the ruined clay tube in his hand. The commander approached and examined the cracked pipe. He asked if it could be repaired. Miller said no. The structure was too damaged. The commander said it did not matter. The device had already done its work. It had changed how 3 engagements were fought. He told Miller that engineers would produce a new version soon. Engineers arrived within the hour. They took the broken Flue and wrapped it in cloth. They said they would use it as a reference for a better model. They planned to create a sturdier frame, a protected mirror mount, and adjustable angles. They told Miller that his idea would move beyond a single platoon. It would be tested across multiple companies. The platoon gathered near a dry field as orders came in. The battalion would halt for the night. Defensive positions needed digging. Rourke assigned sectors. Men spread out and began to work. Miller sat with his pack beside him. His hands rested on his knees. He felt the weight of the day settling over him. The lieutenant approached and sat beside him. He said the brigade had written a report about Miller's observation work. He said the colonel planned to mention Miller in the battalion commendation list. Miller nodded. He said he did not want attention. The lieutenant said recognition did not change the fact that the device saved lives. The platoon ate their rations in silence. Some men talked about the next village. Others talked about home. Miller listened. He thought about the simple tools he used before the war. He thought about the flues, vents, and chimneys he had installed. He had never imagined those skills would matter on a battlefield. Night settled over the field. Artillery echoed in the distance. The battalion set out listening posts. The sky remained clouded. The fields were cold and quiet. At dawn, brigade engineers returned. They carried a new prototype. It was built from metal pipe segments, reinforced with clamps, and fitted with a secured mirror. It was heavier than Miller's version but more durable. They handed it to him and asked for adjustments. Miller inspected the angles. He pointed out where the mirror should sit. He suggested a small ridge to prevent glare. The engineers wrote down everything he said. Word spread through the battalion that Miller had shaped a new observation tool. Soldiers from other companies came to see it. Some wanted to use it. Others asked how it worked. Miller explained the principles again. He used short sentences and pointed to simple parts. The troops understood quickly. They saw its value. Brigade command tested the device later that morning. They observed a distant farmhouse without exposing a single head. The commander approved production of more units. Engineers began preparing materials. They planned to distribute the first batch within days. The battalion stepped off again shortly after. The fields opened toward a long road. The next objective waited beyond the far tree line. The enemy had prepared new positions there. The fight would continue. As the platoon moved, Rourke walked beside Miller. He told him something simple. Innovation kept men alive. Skill from home mattered as much as training. The platoon had survived 3 near impossible positions because Miller saw what others missed. Miller said anyone could have done it. Rourke said that was not true. Most men reacted to danger. Miller observed it. He broke problems down into angles and distances. He used materials on the ground. He worked under fire without hesitation. That separated him from most soldiers. When the battalion reached the next rise, shells began to fall near the treeline. The platoon stepped into cover. Officers scanned the field. Miller held the new device in his hands. It felt solid. It felt ready. He pressed it against a rock, adjusted the mirror, and began mapping the next German line. The platoon waited for his call. He gave it with calm precision. Positions marked. Angles confirmed. Distances measured. The battalion shifted its attack. Mortars prepared fire. Rifle squads adjusted their lanes. Machine gun crews repositioned. The fight was shaped before the enemy fired a shot. Miller handed the device back to the lieutenant. He checked his rifle. He joined the rest of the platoon. They advanced together as one line. Behind them, brigade engineers carried the broken clay flue carefully. They planned to preserve it. They said it was the first of its kind. They said it had rewritten an entire day of fighting. They said the idea deserved to live past the war. The battalion continued forward. The vineyards fell behind them. The fields opened wide. The German line waited ahead. The men pressed on. Ann Miller walked among them with quiet purpose. The man whose small improvised clay flue peak slot had cut a machine gun nest, broken a ridge line, exposed ambushes, shaped an advance, and saved the lives of men who now marched at his side.